Okay, and then you should get something that comes up that's that reminds me to remind you that you're being recorded. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that off and get rid of the transcript because that's quite annoying. And then we can move on. Okay, so just to introduce myself very briefly, my name's Mark Stairs, and I'm Senior Lecturer on the Early Years and Primary team at BCU. And I'm also, this is the reason why I'm doing this, I'm also one of the Year 1 lead tutors. So there's three of us. There's Kath and there's me, and we also have Dominique. And Dominique is the pastoral lead. So we're sort of quite lucky in a way that normally you'd have two tutors, but we have three because we think our Year 1 students need a little bit more nurturing in that early part of the course. Okay, so what we're here to talk about is part 2 of the students' placement. So those of you who are used to having BCU students, or indeed students from other providers who may well offer briefings like this. Normally you'd have one briefing because the placement is consistent all the way through. Year 1 placement at BCU is a little bit different because it's split into two parts. So students have already had part 1, and part 1 was like an immersion into school and classroom life where they weren't expected to formally teach. Part 2, they are expected to formally teach. So those are essentially the differences. So we'll just move on a little bit. So first thing to do, and I did this in the last briefing, I'll probably do it in every briefing that I do with to mentors, is to say thank you for having our students, because obviously you're under no obligation to have them. I know there are some advantages to having students. I know when I was in school, we would have Year 3 students, especially in PGCE students, and that would enable us to fill any vacancies at the end of the year because we'd seen those people teach and they'd be part of our schools. And I know, and obviously other students, if they're good students, they can be extra hands as well. So there are some advantages, but I also know that it is, you know, some time and effort from yourselves and from your class teachers to support students. And hopefully you do see it as we see it as part of supporting the wider community of teaching. So obviously we do appreciate placements and you offering them, because if we didn't have those, we wouldn't be able to train teachers to, you know, be teachers of the future. Okay, right, so let's move forward again. So I've spoken about this a little bit already, about the difference between part 1 and part 2, and I won't belabor these points because, you know, you may be obviously aware of this, and as I say, I am going to be very succinct to move through. There'll be time for questions at the end if you think I've been too succinct. Okay, so we know about part 1. We've spoken about part 1. Students are immersed in school and classroom life. They do have some focused tasks to do as well, but it's in part 2 that they're expected to start teaching formally. Okay, so we will go back over this again, but as it says here, associate teachers will begin to teach 1 lesson a day from the start of part 2. Now, we spoke to all our cohort yesterday, 210 of them, in the lecture theatre for a placement briefing, and we spoke to them about this, and that doesn't mean that they have to come in on Monday morning and teach a whole maths lesson or a whole English lesson or whatever it might be. We have told that they can have a few days, but it would only really be a few days to build up to teaching a whole lesson. So it might be that they agree with you before the start of this block placement that they team teach, or that they teach the introduction to a lesson. We haven't got any strict guidance on what that looks like. That's between you, if you're the class teacher, or your class teacher and that student to negotiate that. But ideally, we would want them to be teaching whole lessons by the end of that first week. Okay, at the end of the placement in the 3rd week, we'd want them teaching 2 lessons a day. Okay, so it says here, and it says in some of the guidance that you'll read, that's a 50% timetable. Now, we're not worried if it's 40%, 60%, 35%, as long as they're teaching 2 lessons a day, that's fine. So I understand that if you're teaching phonics, and then you teach, I don't know, guided reading, you know, that might not add up to 50% in the day, but that's fine. Those are 2 lessons, so that's okay. And it does say in some of the other guidance that teaching can include whole class teaching, and then it goes on to say team teaching, teaching in small groups, one-to-one interventions, and of course it can, but obviously what we don't want is for students to get the end of their placement and they haven't done any whole class teaching, and they're turning around and saying, but I've done lots of group teaching. Group teaching, one-to-one interventions are fine, but we need them to be doing whole class teaching. Okay, so some dates, and I know there's been some changes in the dates. 2 things I've got to remember, which is the extra bank holiday that's appeared, and possible strikes as well. So you can see we had a placement briefing yesterday. That where it says placement briefing, that's the students' placement briefing. Those are the preliminary visits. They have 1 preliminary visit left, which is next Tuesday. As we've explained to students, that is a NEU strike day, and it will vary from school to school as how schools manage that. So we've asked students to liaise with their school. If they can come in, that's great. If the school is shut, we've asked them to try and negotiate another day, to either the Wednesday, the Thursday, or the Friday, for them to come in and make up that day. Okay, so they are aware that possibly be a strike day. We've asked them to liaise with you or your school or your class teacher to try and make up that day on another day. Okay, the placement dates where the actual block placement starts. So we've given those there. Obviously now that Monday is a bank holiday, so you know there's not a lot we can do about that, and students are aware of that. It just gives them some extra time to prepare maybe. And then we have the progress meeting. So students have 2 meetings, 2 formal meetings in a placement. They've had their review meeting, which is the midpoint really at the end of part 1. So they had a meeting with the class teacher, the university tutor, and themselves. And you know, there's certain processes that we go through to talk about their progress. The last meeting for this placement is on in the week beginning the 22nd of the 5th, and the university tutor will, as with all other placements, will email the class teacher and the student and arrange a time suitable for everybody when that meeting can be conducted. Okay, we look a little bit at progress meetings at the end. Again, I'm not going to belabor exactly what happens in a progress meeting or all of the forms, because some of you may be quite familiar with those. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of an idea about where our associate teach, you know, what's happened to them over the years. Some of you may have seen them on placement, so you'll have a very good idea, better idea than I do really, about how well they've got on. But they have, as I said, completed part 1 of their school-based training. So they've had that immersion into school life. They've also completed a number of modules, all the modules for this year. So I've listed them there. I'm not going to go through them all, but they've done modules that support them in the teaching of the core subjects, English, Maths and Science, and all the theory, research, pedagogy that goes into that. They've had a module that talks to them about the teaching of foundation subjects, so PE, math, music, and so on. And they've had 2 professional studies modules, okay, where they've learned about behaviour management, assessment, safeguarding, gender issues, LGBTQ plus in schools, and so on. Okay, and they've obviously attended within professional studies and as part of professional studies, but outside of that as well, you know, a very comprehensive suite of training around safeguarding. So that's where they are coming into part 2 of your placement. Okay, so professionalism. So it is a large topic of conversation that we have with year 1s from the very, very beginning of the year. You know, when they come in on that first week, that induction week, we don't call it professionalism. We wait a little bit into the year before we call it that. But we're talking to them about, you know, what it means to be a professional in school. So we talk about attendance, and we talk about building relationships with adults in a primary setting and all those sorts of things. Later on, as they move towards placement, we start saying, well, this is called professionalism. So it's an ongoing conversation with students, and as it says here, we've engaged with ongoing conversations from induction onwards about what does professionalism mean in schools. And we just ask you, which I'm sure you will do, I'm under no doubt, continue to re-emphasize that message. Okay. There are really, there's a range of things that students, a small number of students find challenging, shall we use that euphemism, on placement. The common ones are that they, as I say, a small minority don't fully understand the importance of following an absence procedure. So schools have an absence procedure. I'm sure your school has one. And students they have to write that down. There's a special space in their progress journal where they write what they have to do. You know, what time do I have to phone by? Who do I have to phone? Am I allowed to leave a message, or do I actually have to physically speak to somebody, or whatever it might be? So some students don't, it takes a while. Hopefully they've got there now, but they might need reminding about that. The other thing to remind you about, or ask you to sort of arrange with the students, or initiate a conversation if they don't around this, is their arrival and departure times. Okay, so it's impossible for us really to say they've got to arrive at a certain time, they've got to leave at a certain time. We do leave those discussions between the teacher and the student, but we give rough guides. So our rough guide is roughly 8 o'clock arrival, 4:15 that you leave. Okay, now if you want to move around those times, that's perfectly fine, but that's a rough guide. What we're obviously trying to avoid is students feeling that they can get in at 8:30 and leave at 3 o'clock, or when the children leave. That's what we're trying to avoid, essentially. So you're well within your rights if students do that to pull them up on it. An easy way not to get to that position is negotiate the arrival and leaving times before they start their block placement. As always, if you feel that you have concerns around that, or indeed anything else, please make sure that you contact the university tutor really swiftly and let them know. Okay, so even if you feel that, okay, we've agreed some times that the student leaves and arrives, and they didn't do it for the first 2 days, I've spoken to them and reminded them. Even at that point, if you just contact the university tutor and let them know you've had a conversation, and then obviously after your conversation, if they're still doing it the next 1 or 2 days, you're going to escalate that together with the university tutor. Okay, but as I'm sure as you understand, our year 1 students, they're on the BA undergraduate route, obviously, and they are quite young. And part of the course is about them maturing. I think some of them are already very mature, but there's always a small number that aren't. And part of them being on placement and part of them being at university is about their growing maturity and understanding about what it means to be a teacher in a school. So that's what I'm saying about conversation. So you have that conversation first, and then you're hoping they would respond to that. But some of them might need that conversation. Okay, so hopefully you already have this. And so that's the mental guidance booklet. So that's got hopefully everything in it that you'd need to know about the placement. You should have a copy already. If not, it's available on the BCU Primary Partnership website. Okay, so I've got a little slide at the end. The link to the Primary Partnership website is at the bottom of all of the emails that we might send you. But you can also just put it into your search engine, BCU Primary Partnership website, and it comes up. And then there's all sorts of things on there related to placement. That Primary Partnership website is essentially for you as lead mentors and mentors, class teachers in school. And it has all this documentation on it as well. And it has that one on it. That's a reminder about that. So you will see students with this, and I'm sure if you are a class teacher, mentor, and you've had students in your classroom, you'll have seen this. This is the progress journal. So this is the main document that they have that structures their placement for them. So in part 1, there'd have been the tasks that they were doing in their progress journal. But in part 2, the documentation is different. So we'll get to a little bit more of that at the moment, but the first thing is some other reminders. So associate teachers, as they have done in part 1, and as they do in any other placement, they keep a placement register. and this just enables them to record their attendance. And what we would ask you to do is sign that. You can see the little orange box at the bottom, just to sign that off at the end to say that that's a true reflection of what their attendance was. Okay. Associate teachers will also have a sign-off meeting with their university tutor. That's a meeting that you don't need to attend. You'll remember from other placements or part one of this placement, there's a big long well, it's not ever so long, it's reasonably long pre-approval checklist that has those boxes that you can cross in it, where it talks about have you familiarized yourself with the school safeguarding policy? Do you understand about GDPR? There's all of that in there. Now we don't want to repeat that again. They've done that for year one, for part one of their placement, sorry. So we don't want to repeat that with students, but what will be happening in that sign-off meeting is that we'll be asking students to tell us about what's your teaching commitment for the first week, and we want to look at some planning. Okay. Now we've told students, obviously, that we will be meeting with them, or the university tutor will be meeting with them at a certain point between that Tuesday and Friday before they start their block placement. It obviously could be that they don't quite have that planning ready, because it might be that at school, the year group they're in, let's say they have their PPA on Friday. So those decisions may not have been come to, and you may need to liaise with the student through email and everything to finalise all of those things. So it's fine if the student doesn't have the planning by that sign-off meeting time, but they will need to agree, however they do that, with the university tutor about emailing that to the university tutor before they start teaching. I'm sure as well, as a class teacher or a lead mentor, you'd want the student to be sharing that planning with you before you let them teach, or you'll have done it with them. However that works, flexibility. What I'm saying is they don't have to have the planning on the day of the sign-off meeting. We can arrange to look at it later. Okay, so we have spoken about this at the beginning, so I'm not going to go over it again. That should be 2 lessons a day there, where it says 2 lessons a week. They're going to start off with 1 lesson a day. Okay, they can build up to that over a few days, but you need to push them if they're a little bit worried or nervous or reluctant. You can build their confidence up and support them, but they need to be doing a whole class lesson teaching really. And by the 3rd week, it's 2 lessons a day. Okay, now students, associate teachers, we have a planning pro forma that we ask them to use. Okay, so we would appreciate it if they don't use the school's planning ways of planning. As I'm sure you're aware, schools now plan. It was different when I was training and teaching all those years ago. Schools plan in very different ways. So some schools will, a PowerPoint is the plan, or annotated white rose planning, or whatever it might be. Obviously, inexperienced first year, second year, even 3rd year students are not in a position where they haven't got the experience to plan like that. So we ask them to plan like I did, maybe some of you did in the olden days, plan from scratch. Have to write it out on a planning pro forma. So this is the planning pro forma that they use, and there is sort of an explanation there about planning, but this front bit is requiring them to put their lesson in context. So especially at this early stage, they might be teaching some one-off lessons, but we want them to put it in context. So if they're teaching maths on a Wednesday and it's about place value, we just want them to note down, what did the children know before, what did they learn before, and what might they be learning, what's the plan for them learning after. So where does my lesson fit in that unit of work? Okay, and then the key bit is the bit that you can see here. It's not an unusual planning format. Okay, so we ask them to use that to plan. Now, obviously, let's take maths for an example. Lots of schools use schemes now. What we're not asking the students to do is ignore the scheme or ignore any other medium-term planning or even short-term planning that the school might have. what we're saying is they're not experienced enough or in a position enough to take that and annotate it and use it. We want them, they can take it, but they've got to not cut and paste it by any stretch, but they've got to take that and put it onto that planning performer, so that they're going through the process of planning the lesson and mentally thinking it or walking it through. Okay, so we do ask that they use that planning performer, and that just ensures that we know that they are planning, they are having a go at planning. Later on in the course, in year 3, they move away from this and start to do it as the school that they're on placement in. So, what we're trying to do is clear up any issues that may arise when students go in, that you're clear, they use that planning performer. They can use your planning, but they have to transpose it onto there so that they're thinking things through. Okay. And obviously, as I've put there at the bottom, I think that's important to mention. I'm sure that's blindingly obvious to you, but they will need at this early stage support with their planning. They're not going to be able to go off and do it on their own. They're going to need, especially that those first week or so, they're going to need people sat with them, helping them to plan. However you manage that, we're not, again, we can't legislate for how that happens. Whether you ask them to go and have a go and they come back and you look at it, however you want to do it is down to you, but they'll need support and advice around that. Okay, another document that students will be bringing into school. Now, you may have seen it, but we haven't asked them to use this yet. So students have a document called the Subject Specific Development Journal. And this is a way in which we connect what they learn at university to what they practice on placement. So all of the modules that the students have had, the foundation modules and the core modules, they have this booklet, and it lists each session at university they have with what we might understand as a learning objective. It's called a learn that and a learn how in the booklet. And they write some notes about what they've learned. So they've got the learn that. I learned that talking partners could be an effective tool for teaching or whatever in that particular session. And then the next column, they've got learn how. So that means that when they're on placement and they're teaching, or for year 1 when they're observing, they can see the teacher using talking partners, or they may have a go at planning for talking partners. And in the learn how column, they can make some comments about how they've implemented that. So it's about implementing what they learned on at university. Okay, and we have asked students to make sure that they show you this. There's some sort of, you don't have to have a lengthy discussion, a few minutes, about their subject specific development journal in the weekly meetings. Okay, and obviously you would also need to have a bit of a look at it with the student, or the student show you when you're planning. So if they're going to be planning a maths lesson, the student will need to look in the subject specific development. Okay, well, what did I learn about the teaching of maths at university? And in consultation with my class teacher, how can I try and apply some of this? Okay, obviously they'll be learning lots of other stuff with you as well. It's not, we're not rigid. It's not they only must teach what's in there. There'll be other stuff they're doing as well, but we want them to see those connections between theory and research and practice. Okay, similarly, they have another booklet called a Professional Studies Development Journal, which is about professional studies. And there's a section in the weekly meetings where we ask them to, again, a few minutes conversation about what they've learned or seen about professional studies. And it works in the same way. There's a learn that, and then there's a learn how. Okay, so they might have a learn that, I don't know, positive reinforcement is often used as a behaviour management strategy. I'm not sure what it is. I don't teach professional studies, but let's imagine that's one. So they've learned that in professional studies, and they've got a learn how column, and they might look for where the teacher's using that or how they've used that. Okay. Right. So those are the documents. They've got a progress journal that's central to their placement. They've got these two other documents, subject specific development journal, professional studies development journal, and that's about them making links between the BCU curriculum, the curriculum they learn at university, and how they can apply those things into their teaching. Okay, so those are those 3 documents. And then in terms of their week at school, there's 3 weeks, but in terms of the week at school as a unit, there are 3 things that we're expecting them to do. So it is their responsibility. There's no assumption that you are going to hold their hand and remind them lots about this. I mean, it'd be helpful if you think they've forgotten and you remind them, but nobody's expecting you to give huge amounts of reminders and support. It's not your responsibility to remind them, essentially. But there's 3 things they're going to do, and some of them are to do with you as well as a class teacher, including this one. So the first one is they will need a weekly meeting between the student and the class teacher. Okay, so we have asked them to initiate that conversation with the class teacher and negotiate a time and a date every week where they can meet. And there's a pro forma in their progress journal, as you can see up on the screen there, and we've asked them to ensure that every box is filled out. Okay, we've also told them it's not an assignment. You don't have to write reams and reams in there. It doesn't matter how you write, whether you write it in flowing sentences or you use bullet points or notes, but it's a record of the meeting that's taken place. Okay, and you can see where the blue arrows are. Those are where you you or the student makes some comments about their professional studies development journal. What have they seen in school that relates to the BCU curriculum and the subject specific development journal? Okay, now again, I'm not going to go through the form. Lots of you might be familiar with it already, but it's fairly self-explanatory. Okay, and again, it's between you and the student as to how you fill that out. If you want to fill that out at the time you're doing the meeting, or somebody makes some notes and goes away and fills it out, it's entirely up to you. One of the key things I will mention in the weekly meeting is that's where you're setting the 3 targets. So you set 3 targets in consultation with the student about what they're going to be focusing on next week. Now, obviously, those targets need to be really narrow and achievable within a week. So there's no point copying and pasting a curriculum theme into there, or putting things like to improve behaviour management, or to improve formative assessment, or to improve subject knowledge. Those are just too broad and big, aren't they? So you really need to narrow it down. So an example might be if it's their first week of teaching or the second week of teaching, and let's say they're struggling to gain whole class attention, that you might have to, I don't know if you do, but I'm sure it will be different from school to school, but let's say you use a stop sign, you put your hand up. So one of the targets might be to use the stop sign in whole class teaching to gain children's attention, and that's something that students could do within a week. Or if you know that they're going to be teaching, we spoke about place value, if you know they're going to be teaching place value in year 2, you might have a target that says be secure in place value for year 2, because you're going to teach it. Okay, so something is narrowable and achievable within a week. Okay. Second thing they're going to be doing, and this is really up to them. You don't have to sort of put anything in a box. They might ask you questions around this, but there's no sort of work to do in that. So we ask the students to observe a lesson every week. Now, as it says here in the yellow box, obviously they're going to be doing lots of watching and joining in during their placement, because they're only teaching even at the end 2 lessons a day. But we would like them to once a week to really step back and watch a lesson where they're not having necessarily to work with groups or feel the need to join in and support children. So they're really taking a step back and really having a close look at exactly what's going on in that teaching, with the dynamics between the teacher and the children and so on. And they fill out this proforma. Okay, that's not your responsibility. You might need, if you might want to remind them, or you might even want to have a quick look at it in a weekly meeting. That'd be great, but it's not your responsibility to ensure that that's completed. The other thing that is more down to the class teacher is the lesson observation feedback form. So every week, just like on other placements, the student needs to be formally observed. So again, we all know, don't we, that you'll be giving them lots of informal feedback, but at one point in the week, just like with the other thing the students doing, you need to step back and really closely look to see what is happening when the students teach. Okay. Just a couple of points to mention. There is a different, there's only 2 observation feedback forms. There's this one, and there's one if the student teaches SSP or phonics. Okay, there is a different form. That's in their progress journal. Both forms are in their progress journal. And obviously, if you're familiar with placements, the university tutor will come in at some point during the placement to do a joint observation with you. Now, there's no set times for that. I think most tutors would be quite sensible and leave it till the last week, which is what I'm going to do, because you want students to build up a little bit of confidence and be able to teach a whole lesson for you to come and watch. I don't think there's no point coming in the first week and watching them teach an introduction to history or anything. It's good and always relevant, as important as that might be. You can't see enough to get a good idea about what's going on. Okay, but obviously the university tutor would be emailing the student or the student and yourself to arrange that. Okay, so that's what happens every, they've got the progress journal, subject specific development journal, professional studies development journal, those 3 central documents, and then those 3 weekly things that are happening, okay, alongside the planning and the teaching, obviously. And when they get towards the end of their placement, the university tutor will email you or and the student, or maybe just the student, depending how we're working it. Usually I would email the class teacher mentor as well, and they'll arrange a progress meeting, a time for a progress meeting in the week beginning the 22nd of the 5th. Okay, again, I should imagine most students, I can't speak for them all because sometimes they've got commitments at other points and it's very difficult to manage, but most of us will try and leave that till the end of the week because it's a 3-week part 2 of the placement, so you want to give the student all the time that they can before you have that progress meeting. Okay, so the progress meeting will either take place face-to-face in school or online. Okay, prior to the review meeting, there's certain things the student needs to do, some of which we'll cover. I'll just tell you that in a minute so that you know. But the class teacher and the student will need to meet to complete the BCU assessment tracker, which is at the back of their progress journal that lots of you all may already be familiar with. Okay. Now, it is only a 3-week block placement. In some of the guidance, it asks that you look at the BCU assessment tracker every week. I think that's a bit unwieldy because there's quite a lot in it. And I think if you're having a weekly meeting and you're looking at the BCU assessment tracker every week, that's going to take up a large chunk, if not all of your meeting. So my guidance always is that you may be especially the first week, let's say behaviour management has come up as a bit of an issue. You might want to look at the assessment tracker where it says behaviour management and what can, and if they have a good go at it, and then what can we highlight off? There's no requirement for you to have looked through all of it by this point. But having said that, when the progress meeting is due, you do need to sit down and look at it with the student. Okay, so again, we're not legislating exactly how that happens. It could be that the class teacher takes it away and has a look at it and then brings it back to the student and has a bit of a conversation, or they sit down and do it together. Essentially, you have to highlight some statements. Again, my advice would be not to belabor. I'm sure lots of you are used to having to look through statement banks and highlight them if you've got tracking systems that work like that. And so the key to it is, I'm sure, is not to get bogged down in the finer details. You're just giving yourself, can they do it or can't they? And there is guidance. Let me find that quickly, so I might have it on another slide. There we go. So there is guidance in the progress journal. This is for this part of the thing that gives you an idea about, okay, I can see the progress journal. It says working towards, working at, working beyond. What am I supposed to highlight? I'm not sure. It's the year 1 student at the end of their placement. So this helps you. So associate teachers who are on track to be awarded QTS at the end of the course, when all they get up to year 3, will be demonstrating their competence in 75% of each BCU curriculum theme at the working towards level. Okay, so that is the very first column that you can see there. So at this point, unless they are an astonishing student, I wouldn't really be expecting to see anything in the working at. Okay, because really the working at is where you will be, you know, they have to have I can't remember exactly, it's either all or 80% of that highlighted to pass the course. Okay, so you think they've got quite a few years to get there. So it most, you know, probably will be in the working towards column. Only 75% for each section needs to be highlighted for them to be average, you know, them to be on track. So that's a bit of a heads up about that. Critical incidents, again, you don't need to worry about that as a class teacher or a lead mentor. If you want to remind them, that's great, but they've had clear instructions about these because they've done one now. We've given them clear instructions. Essentially, it's an opportunity for them in the progress meeting to discuss in more detail an area of a journey through an area of learning around teaching, and they can, this time they can more or less choose what they want. Okay, but we've spoken to them a lot about that, and I'm sure if you've been in review and progress meetings, the university tutor takes a lead on that, really, unless you've had lots of involvement, and that's great. Okay, we've done that one. Okay, so we touched on this at the beginning, and again, sure lots of you may have had experiences of this before in terms of I hope you haven't had terrible experiences, but you understand the process if you needed it to. So if you have concerns about an associate teacher, now whatever that is, you know, sometimes we have people who say we're really concerned about their well-being. They turn up every day, they seem a bit sad or whatever. It could be that, couldn't it? It could be about their professional behaviour. You know, we spoke about absence and attendance and coming in on time. It could be that you are, after a few weeks, I mean, remember they're quite young and just starting to teach, and then, you know, very few of us were, I definitely wasn't, you know, fantastic out of the block, but you might have some real concerns about their teaching. Regardless of what the concern is, please make sure that you contact the university tutor early on and don't leave it, because I mean, I've had a placement very recently where somebody had left it a little bit longer than perhaps it wasn't too problematic, but it's always easier if you contact the university tutor and let them know what's happening. Then the university tutor can decide if they need to intervene at that point, or we can give it a few days because you've had a conversation. So just to let you know as well, there is and again, you may be aware of this, but there is a process. It's not just they're not doing very well, okay, well, let's give them a little bit longer and it just forever goes on. There is a quite strict process if we have real concerns about student, okay, that we can go through. And obviously schools as well. I mean, I don't want that to happen, but just so you're aware, schools can terminate placements at any point. You don't have to go through that process. And schools do, you know, if something badly goes wrong, and they might just say, look, we can't do it anymore. So those options are there, but normally we might go through a bit more of a process where we setting targets with students, very strict, time-limited targets to see if they can achieve them. Okay, so just a reminder about the primary partnership website. So if you've been with us for a while, you'll know that this is new and it's a sort of work in progress, but it is there, and it's got lots of information on it that before we may have had to email to you or whatever, but it's lots of information and documents and sitting there, and that's where you might have had the link for the briefing this evening and so on. So the link for the primary partnership website is at the bottom of all of our emails from BCU, but you can just put it into your search engine to find it. Okay, some useful contacts. So Nadeem Hussain, who you might not need to have much contact with, but he's the place that we have a big administrative team because obviously we're a very big provider, and they are the ones who do lots of other things, but they do placements as well. So Nadeem Hussain is the gentleman who organises all the placements. You may have had emails off him if you're dealing with that side of things. Anne Whitaker is she's the lead on the primary partnership team, so you may have heard of her. There's the year one lead, so that's myself, Kath and Dominique, but really your main contact is the university tutor for that placement. But I really don't mind if something happens and you feel you need to email me, or Kath or Dominique. It might be me because you've seen me here now. Okay, so I really don't mind that if you feel the need to do that. Okay, right. So I said I'd try to be quick. I think, what is it? What time did we start? So I've been probably about 40 minutes, not too bad. Has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask? No? Are we all okay? I won't sit here for ages. Let me just put on the chat because I can see there might be some that have come up.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you can.
Sorry, I'll put my camera on. It was just about one of the early meetings that you mentioned at the beginning, and you said that it's the one on the 2nd, it's the one on the strike day. You said that we don't need to attend that.
No, there's a sign-off meeting, which that's called the sign-off meeting. That can happen at any point between the Tuesday and the Friday. But that you again, you don't really need to worry about that. That's between the student and the university tutor.
Okay, that's great.
Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you. Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks.
Yes, okay. Are the students taking on marking? Yeah. I mean, we can't be very strict, for want of a better word, about what we demand off you as a placement school, and nor would we. I think that wouldn't work, would it? About students have got to teach maths and they've got to mark a book and they've got to do an assembly in this part of their placement. It's just unworkable, really. So those are that's a sort of the dynamics between the class teacher and what they think the student is able to do, and some students may be very confident and keen to take on extra things, and that's great. I'd let them have a go. Some might need a little bit more support, but yes, marking, but it's part of a teacher's role. So obviously you're not going to, sorry, I don't know your first name, but Miss or Mr. Bristow, you're not going to let them loose on your books with little to no experience, but some marking experience. Maybe they mark next to you, they watch you mark for a bit, and then you give them a book or whatever, however your marking looks like. That would be good. Okay. Anybody else? No, I'll take it that I won't. It's not like students. I won't get. I won't sit back. It's not like coaching, and I sit back and wait for a question. I'll take that. That's all done, and that's okay. All right then. So I hope I hope those of you are having students. I'm sure it will be, but I hope that's a positive experience. And I hope that's been useful, the information that we've given. Okay, somebody's typing. Okay. Oh, I don't know. I'm not sure what's happened to that. Okay, so I'll hang around for a little bit, but if you haven't got a question, that's great. And thank you very much for coming. Okay, thank you.